Welcome to the Catholic OCD Podcast. I am not Nick Nolfi. I'm Dr. Ben Safranski, your guest host for today. Think of me as the Father Gregory Pine to Nick's Matt Frad. And today we are talking about the Eucharist, and especially where does the Eucharist come from in the Old Testament? So stay tuned. So if you're Catholic, or maybe even if you're not, you might have heard that in the Catholic Church in the U.S., we're in the middle of this Eucharistic revival, right? Eucharistic revival. This is something that the United States bishops have decided that we should do because they want to re-energize us. They want us to have a renewed reverence for the Eucharist and understanding of the Eucharist and devotion to the Eucharist. The Church says that the Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life. The source because it's where our Christian life comes from, and the summit because it is the highest point of what we are all about as Catholics. One of the things, and this is what I want to talk about mostly today, that I think can give us trouble when we're thinking about the Eucharist, is that we don't really know where it comes from. I believe as Christians, and especially as Catholics, we don't know our Old Testament well enough. And so today I want to work on that a little bit. I'm hoping we could think about some really, really interesting Old Testament passages for the Eucharist. And when we do this, I think we'll see that when Jesus institutes the Eucharist at the Last Supper, it isn't as sudden or as strange as we might think it is to start with. So when you think about the Eucharist in the Old Testament, if you've studied the Bible or if you've studied the Eucharist much, one of the first things you probably think about is Passover, right? The Jewish feast of the Passover. And what I want to do is get the Passover out of the way in the beginning so we can go to things that we don't talk about nearly as much. So, of course, knowing about the Jewish feast of the Passover is super important for understanding the Eucharist. Why? Well, it's how we understand the Eucharist, first of all, as a sacrifice, because the Feast of the Passover is where the Lamb of God is sacrificed for the forgiveness of sins and for the salvation of Israel. And so that's really important. When you read about the Passover carefully, you see so many things that echo the Eucharist for us, and those things aren't really accidental, right? As Catholics and as Christians, we talk about being marked with the blood of the Lamb who died for our sins, and those images are totally out of the Passover feast and the stuff that goes around the Passover, right? When the Jews sacrifice the lamb before they leave Egypt, they're supposed to take some of its blood and mark the Jewish households with it so that when the angel of death comes, he'll know which households not to destroy. Now, the other thing that the Passover is, which connects to our understanding of the Eucharist, our understanding of the Lord's Supper we celebrate every Sunday, every day as Catholics, is that the Passover is a ritual meal, right, that binds the community together in its identity as the chosen people of God. That's something that the Passover does for the Jews, and the Eucharist, that's an important part of what the Eucharist does for Christians. But what I really want to spend a little bit more time talking about today is something that we really don't hear as much and we don't talk about as much when we're thinking about the Eucharist. And for me, when I first started kind of learning about this, it totally blew my mind, because it was something I'd never heard about learning about the Old Testament. And that is the idea of God's presence with the Israelites in the Old Testament stories. So like when you go back and you read the Old Testament stories carefully, and especially the story of the Exodus, you start to see that like a big part of this story is about God's presence with his people, right? And when I say presence, I don't mean a kind of vague or general presence, right? In the way that, all Christians believe that God is with us because he created the world and he's watching out for us, right? Or even in the sense of God having like a special care for us. That's another way that like God could be present to us. When let's say if I'm like praying with somebody who's going through something difficult, or if I'm going through something difficult, or my family's going through something difficult and I'm praying, I might ask God to come be with us in that moment, to be present with us in that moment. That is a way that God can be present with us, right? But here's what I really mean, and here's what we're going to get to in the Old Testament, is that way back, as far as the Exodus, and even into Genesis, God knew that people would need him to be there with him, to be present with them in like unique, special ways. And when I'm talking about this, I usually talk about the local presence of God. So let's talk a little bit about God in the Old Testament. We're going to go back to Genesis and Exodus here. So when you think of the God of the Old Testament, like speaking to people, you might think of, if you're like me, you might think of God as a kind of disembodied voice, right? As a prophet sitting down to pray, and this kind of like voice from the heavens of God speaking to him. Or you might think of God's voice coming from the clouds, like, who is it, Mufasa in The Lion King, speaking to Simba, like, I will always be with you, Israel. Or maybe even like from the burning bush in Exodus, but it's not the whole story. So starting with Abram in the book of Genesis, God will come down to his people and basically say, look, I'm going to be with you in a specific place. Now, he may not be visible. In fact, he's not visible. That's part of what makes him God. If he's visible, then he's too limited, and he could become like an idol, like the rest of the nations had. But he will come, like let's say he'll come to Abram in Genesis 15 when they are making a covenant. And if you really want to have your mind blown for the first time by God's presence with Israel, go to Genesis 15 and read about the covenant he makes with Abram when he tells Abram to take these animals, right, cut them in half. And so Abram does this. He cuts all these sacrificial animals in half. And then Abram sees, what do we see in the scriptures? We see a fire pot and a torch, or so in some translations it says a brazier, like this fire pot, this place where you'd have a fire, and they pass between the pieces of the animal. Did you ever wonder what the heck was going on with the fire pot and the brazier? Well, what's really going on with the fire pot and the brazier is that is where God is passing between the animals. Okay? In Abram's world, in the ancient Near East, when two people made a covenant, right, a kind of binding agreement where they were going to lay down their lives as part of a set of promises that they're going to make to each other. The lesser part of the part, there's always a lesser party to the covenant, which in this case is Abram. He has less power. He has less to offer. He's dependent on God. God is the greater part of the covenant, right? He's the greater party. And one of the things they would do is the greater party, he would pass between the pieces of the sacrificial animal as a way of saying, look, if I don't live up to my part of the bargain, and let me be split in two like these animals are. Okay, so that's just a hint of where we're going. The fire pot and the brazier sort of show us that God is almost like, not exactly, but he's almost coming down to earth to walk between those animals, right? To be with Abram. But, when you're talking about starting with Abram and other members of God's elect, other people that God elects, like Moses, they often ask God to dwell with them, right? So they'll say things like, God, go with us, go with Israel, or lead our armies. Now, I don't know if you ever stopped for a second and thought, why would you ask that of the God of the entire universe, right? If you know that God created everything and he dwells everywhere, why would you ask him to come dwell with you? Well, we're going to get to that, and I think that the short answer is because God knows that since we don't fill the whole universe, since we're local people, we dwell in specific places, that we're going to need him to kind of dwell in specific places with us at times. Okay? So let's talk about when this gets really, really strong. This idea of God's presence with the Israelites, especially in the book of Exodus. And I want to talk, we talked about the Passover a little bit, all right? And that's in Exodus chapters 12 and 13. If you want to do a little close reading of the Exodus, 12 and 13. But let's talk about when when Moses and the Israelites have gone out of Egypt. They wandered through the desert, right? Led by God's presence, represented by the cloud by day and the fire by night. But when it really gets freaky, if you will, is when they get to Mount Sinai, right? Mount Sinai is where they're given this really close experience of God, this mountaintop experience. And when Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, God starts giving him a bunch of commands about different things to do. One of the things God gives Moses this command about is building the Ark of the Covenant, right? So when we think of the Ark of the Covenant, see, we've got a little model right here on the desk of our Ark of the Covenant. I want you to think about that a little bit. So here I want to read a little bit of the especially important passages from Exodus 25. I'm going to read verses 10 through 22, and this is when God is telling Moses how to build the ark. And I want you to listen to this because it's important, but there's one part that is especially important, and I'll point it out when we get there. God gives his directions for building the ark that's basically a wooden box covered with gold, right? He says, "You shall make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high." Tells him to cover it with gold. He tells him to put rings on the outside and poles through the rings so that they can carry the ark. He says, "In the ark, you are to put the covenant which I will give you." So a covenant isn't a physical thing. A covenant is an agreement or a relationship. But what we usually think that means is that Moses is supposed to put the tablets with the commandments written on them inside the ark. And they'll put some other things in the ark later. But God goes on and he talks about the top of the ark. Now here's where it gets interesting. He says, "You shall then make a cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. Make 2 cherubim of beaten gold for the 2 ends of the cover." So the cherubim, those are these 2 little angels you see here on the top of the ark. You put one at one end and the other at the other end. It says, "The cherubim shall have their wings spread out above, sheltering the cover with them. They shall face each other with their faces looking toward the cover. This cover you shall then place on top of the ark." And in verse 22, I want you to listen to this for a second, okay? Listen to it like you've never heard the book of Exodus before. "There I will meet you, And there, from above the cover, between the two cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, I will tell you all that I command you regarding the Israelites. Okay, pay attention to that verse for a minute. There. Listen to that word there. When do we use the word there? We use it when we're trying to point out like a specific place, right? And God says, there, between the cherubim on top of the cover is where I will meet you and I will talk to you. And this isn't isolated. This is like the center. This is where I want us to focus when we're thinking about God's presence with the Israelites. But starting here and going forward through the rest of the Jewish history of salvation, the Israelites always believe that God is present with them in a specific place. Now, he's not an idol, right? The Philistines and the other, bad guys of the Old Testament, they all believed that they had their gods with them because they believed that they were statues, right? They were like idols. God doesn't want to be made into an idol. He doesn't want to be fashioned into a statue because guess what? He's the God of the universe. And an idol or a statue can't hold him. But he does say that I'm going to be in this place in a way that I am not going to be in other places. Right? So when the Israelites leave Sinai and wander a little bit longer and get into all sorts of crazy adventures, they carry the ark with them. And eventually God has them do what with the ark? He has them take it to Jerusalem, where during the time of King Solomon, he has them build a temple, right? This massive stone temple that's on this even more massive holy platform, right? That we call the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And when God tells them about building the temple, he tells them to put the Ark of the Covenant at the center of it. And it's there that the Jews believe God's holiness, God's presence dwells specifically, right? And this is so powerful that for the Jews, that even after the temple is destroyed, right, by the Babylonians, and the ark is lost, when they rebuild the temple, they still believe that God's presence dwells there in a place that it does not dwell anywhere else. So when we think about like God, when we start to think about, getting closer to the time of Christ and Christ saying to the apostles, this is my body, which will be given for you. And the apostles believing, understanding that God was present in that bread and in that wine in a way that he wasn't present in other places. This is what we should be thinking of. We should be thinking of God's presence on the tabernacle, God's presence on the Ark of the Covenant, in the tabernacle and in the temple eventually. Now, the next question you might ask if you say, okay, well, Dr. Ben, why would God do this? Right? That's the difference. Isn't that the difference between the gods that the other, like the pagans believed in and the God that the Israelites believed in? That the Israelites, the Jews, believed that their God was the God of the entire universe and couldn't be put into a statue, wouldn't be put into an idol. And that's absolutely true, which is why he doesn't want to be made into an idol, which is why they get in so much trouble for making the golden calf, right? When they think they've made their God into like a gold statue. But what I would suggest, what I think is that God knew that though he is the God of the universe and is present everywhere, we are not, right? He created us. He knows that we are specific, right? That we're small in a sense. We're contained by our bodies. St. John Paul II, in his Theology of the Body, said that we are, in a sense, our bodies, which means that we are confined to a specific location. And so I think he knew that people would need and would want a place to go in order to worship him, to be with him, a place to know that he was there in a different way from how he was present everywhere and in all of creation, right? And I think we know that about ourselves. We know that as humans who are limited, who have bodies, that we need to see people, we need to be with people, we need to be in front of people in a particular place, right? So for example, when I think about this, I think of like long distance relationships or friendships. You know, it's kind of a trope. People will say that like a long distance relationship is really hard to maintain, doesn't last. Well, you know, if you have, any close relationship you're in, whether it's romantic or whether it's with a parent or a child or a sibling, you know that there's something different about being in a room with that person than there is about talking to them on the phone, right? You ever travel and you call home or you Skype home to talk to your wife or your husband or your kids or whatever, and it just feels like, it's something to hear their voice, but it's just getting you through to the next time you can be in the same spot. Well, I think God knows us, and he doesn't want our relationship with him to be any less real and any less intense than those relationships we have with other human beings when we're together in a place and we're looking at each other. So as I said before, as we start getting, towards the end, let's talk about getting towards the end of the Old Testament, and we get towards Jesus instituting the Eucharist at the Last Supper. We think about that presence of God in the temple, and we think about Jesus telling the people to destroy this temple, and in 3 days it will be raised up, right? We got to realize that when the apostles are at the Last Supper with Jesus and he is foretelling his own death, and they're thinking about how Jesus has just compared his own body to the temple, that a big part of that is thinking about the presence of God in the temple and how that presence is now in Jesus's body. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this and what the apostles did with this when we talk about the New Testament and when we talk about the what the early church thought about the scriptures in our next video. I want to leave you with one last thought. It is not an accident that in our churches we keep the Eucharist in a box covered with gold, because the church has always thought of the tabernacles in our churches as the new arks of the covenant that contain the presence of God. So that's going to be it for this episode of the Catholic OCD Podcast. I hope you will like and subscribe. Look me up on YouTube, Dr. Ben Safranski, and keep listening to Nick, and keep an eye out for the next video in this series when we're going to talk about the Eucharist in the New Testament and in the early church.